Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meru Media podcast. Today, we are joined with Professor Vamsee Juluri, who is a professor of, I think, media and arts in San Francisco, correct?
Media studies, yeah.
Media studies. Okay, and and you're the author of actually multiple books. I think multiple genres you actually covered. You've done a book called Rearming Hinduism and Cracked Across the World, and also he also has done fiction work with his recent Kishkinda series, writing about the first book, which I read, was Saraswati's Intelligence, which I really thoroughly enjoyed. Was about like Hanuman and kind of taking the Ramayana to prehistory of some sort. It felt very like it's part of human evolution, and so Professor Juluri is well well versed and well adept in a variety of different writing styles and interests. So today, actually, we're joined by not only Professor Juluri, but my colleague Racchit. So Racchit, say hi.
Hey everyone, good to see you again.
So, Professor, could you give us a brief, brief or however long you want, on your background and how you got into media studies, and like kind of like where you grew up and what, and I'm just playing it out saying you came to America at some point and how that happened.
Yeah, yes. It's an apt, I guess, to begin with how I came to America because it's a land of not only dreams but renewal, I suppose, where you find it meaningful, especially during the summer holiday months. So, okay, reflect on why you came here and things like that.
Yeah.
End of the semester, sometimes you have that slight phew, was it worth it kind of thing, but then suddenly somehow again you feel restored and you think of all the good times you had in class and the nice
Right.
papers you and the friends you meet like yourself and the chance to be on forums like this and say, hey, this conversation is getting more and more global and diverse and interesting. So yes, I'll begin briefly with my how I came to America story. uh, so I was born and I grew up in Hyderabad in southern India. My parents and I are Telugu.
Hmm.
And it's very interesting that my American dream got seeded when I was very young, probably like hardly 10 years old.
Right.
Because like many kids in India at the time, I grew up reading American books and comics and movies and everything. And I think my childhood in Hyderabad was a very interesting mix of an Indian village, like the elders and grandparents, my mom being in movies and politics at the time. There were a lot of fascinating people who would come from the villages. So there
Sure.
was a kind of a atmosphere I grew up in. And at the same time, there was this American dream right at the heart of it. And it sort of reached a very important culmination when I was 12 years old and I came to visit America with my mother.
Hmm.
And we did road trips all up the East Coast from California to Grand Canyon. And I think those 3 or 4 months made a very strong and vivid impression on me. And I remember visiting the Hare Krishna temple in Berkeley. Uh, and of course, 20 years later, I end up, in the same town, more or
Yeah.
less. Yeah, I had a little bit of a childhood fascination with America. Then, but after I, returned after my childhood holiday for several years, I kind of slowly um lost. I mean, I didn't really actively pursue this idea that I needed to come to the US. And how that happened, and it also explains my career path in a way.
Hmm.
Uh, by the time I came to high school, my parents wanted me to study engineering, like most parents in India.
Right.
And after I finished my uh, 12th, I went to study engineering in Bangalore, though my heart was not really in it. And I could see that I was reasonably good at writing. Engineering, math, I was not all that good. But anyway, I had too much too proud to tell my parents, that I couldn't do it. So I said, what's the big deal? And I went to Bangalore. And then I quit after 2 years. I simply could not handle engineering. And then I just began to write and read and think about the meaning of life and that sort of stuff, and worry my parents.
Yeah.
But eventually, I managed to sort of get my path back straight again by studying journalism at IIMC in Delhi, and that's when I kind of realized that there was this new field emerging, at least in India, mass communication or media studies. And I thought it was very interesting to study the media and to study popular culture. And then I sort of resumed my childhood adventure and longing for the American dream, and ended up coming here. I studied in the Midwest and also in the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where I did my PhD. And then I taught for a couple of years in New England. And then in 2001, I came to USF, and that was a very happy place to come to, because when I was in India, I grew up listening to the 60s music.
Yeah.
And to actually land up like 2-3 blocks away from Haight-Ashbury, it was really nice. And yeah, so I've been teaching at USF. I teach classes on a whole range of media studies topics, Indian cinema, Bollywood, that's a popular topic. Then I also used to teach a class called Media Stereotyping and Violence. And that was a class they just sort of made me teach when I joined, because I was a new guy.
Right.
Then, the horrible events of 9/11 happened. And so that time, I started reading Gandhian philosophy and nonviolence. And so, yeah, that's sort of how this whole journey started, both coming to media studies from engineering and also sort of making this home in America.
Sure. So when you went to journalism in Delhi and then decided to do your master's and come to the U.S., was your, at that time, were you trying to become a journalist, or were you trying to do more of like actually get into the PhD program and do more of like the scholarly academic work? What were you kind of what was your, like, I guess, goal at that point?
Hey, great question. So when I started studying in IMC, I think I just wanted to be a journalist and a writer.
Yeah.
Because I did not really have a conception at that time that one could study the media, or I didn't have a very clear understanding of what the social sciences were.
Right.
I just knew that I liked writing, and so I thought I had a very nuts and bolts technocratic understanding, I think, of what education meant. So when I started in IMC, I just thought I would complete my studies and probably become a journalist and live in Delhi, and it wasn't very well thought out, but somewhere along the way, and I should actually give full credit to, I guess, the Indian government and IMC, because they had a decent library, and in the library they had all these journals like Media, Culture and Society, and some of these books about media and culture. And once I started reading those, I suddenly found happiness, in a manner of speaking, and I just thought that, I would actually like to be somebody who researches the media, talks about media, and because I could also see, and this is a very important context, 91, 92 was the time that India opened up the economy, the economic liberalization. And that was also the time Star TV began. And, the changes in Indian everyday life, and, the very rapid way in which satellite TV sort of changed the landscape, and then the Gulf War, CNN,
Sure.
all these things were rapidly. So I somehow finally had a aha moment, and I thought, okay, I could spend my life, talking about what media is all about and what's going to people.
So, I mean, it's actually interesting. I mean, I feel like that early 90s period globally was actually like this true explosion of understanding the true power of media. For some reason, like, this is right around the time where Fox News started coming up, and you had this, it no longer was it just like in India. I think before it was just like Doordarshan. That was kind of like what, a few channels here and there. And suddenly after the 90s, there was this massive growth of and not just in India, but I think globally, of the media houses and channels and different perspectives, and how to like how media has such a powerful influence on human beings at a somewhat visceral level. I think that the early '90s period. So I think it was probably like the iron was hot, and you kind of just struck at that point.
Yeah, very true. I mean, for once, I think, and I mean, again, as somebody who had dropped out of engineering,
Yeah.
uh, it was a scary thing. Now, when I think about it, which is why probably I'm usually very empathetic to my students, because I do have this memory of how stressful undergrad life can be,
Yeah.
and yeah, so for a while I wasn't even sure whether I would turn out to be good at this or whether I would stick to this.
Right.
Uh, Somehow I was fortunate, especially once I got into my PhD program, and I started reading, British cultural studies. I think it was like a moment when I suddenly realized how little I knew,
Yeah.
and I said, wow, there is so much to study, so much to learn, and yeah, and like you said, I think the '90s were a very, very interesting time because you know um, it was almost like an overnight explosion in media culture,
Yeah.
and yeah, so it was a good moment to be studying all of that.
So, I mean, before you started, in the past few years, you've gotten very focused on the Hindu and media presence. Before that period, you were teaching for numerous years. What was your expertise? Were you more like American pop culture? Were you more Indian, like general pop culture? Or, I mean, what area did you kind of focus on before you got into particularly the Hindu side?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting set of journeys, which sort of brought me to this present kind of writing that I'm doing,
Yeah,
mainly on Hinduism and also on Hinduphobia. Um, in the '90s, so my focus was mostly on globalization, because and satellite TV and the changes that were taking place on a worldwide scale. And my PhD dissertation was on a very interesting topic, which was MTV in India.
interesting.
And yeah, uh, there was actually a channel called Channel V.
I remember.
Yeah, you remember Channel V, and so mid '90s, all across Asia, Channel V was very popular, and then MTV India also came along, and I was very interested in doing audience research because in the field of media studies, there were two broad views. I guess one was the sort of Marxist traditional view, which said that this is all cultural imperialism, and global media is destroying local cultures, and then there was more celebratory view, on the other side. But when I did audience research, I think started to think in a much more nuanced way about how, on the one hand, audiences have agency. They do interpret media in very, very complex ways, and you can really understand the meanings that they're bringing to the media. But at the same time, issues of power do remain. And so my first book was basically a study of music TV reception in India. And then I think the other other topic I got really interested in, especially just after I came to San Francisco, was this whole debate on media and violence, because I was given the class to teach, and then when 9/11 happened, there was this whole Fox News, flashing red light warnings about terrorism, and WMDs, and so there was a sense of fear in the US at that time, and all these debates on whether human nature is violent or whether religion is violent.
Mhm.
And at that time, I think I kind of had a second beginning in terms of a new intellectual direction.
Yeah.
Uh, and again, it was just I was very fortunate to be in the Bay Area because I had no idea till then that there was so much of applicability or relevance in Indian thought to contemporary global social problems, particularly the question of violence.
Yeah.
So I remember reading, quite a lot about Gandhi and trying to understand the whole critique of nonviolence. And I think somewhere, in that time period, in the early 2000s, On the one hand, I started getting fascinated by the depth of, I guess, Indian thought. I mean, even through this little uh, toehold that got into it via Gandhi and
Yeah.
writing colonial theory. And at the same time, I started to notice that almost every time there was something about India generally or Hinduism particularly in the media, um, it was highly inaccurate and it was sometimes very, very hateful and spiteful. And what surprised me was the fact that here I was teaching in this field of critical cultural studies, where in almost all media studies classes, we are talking about representation, right? We are fighting the misrepresentation of women, we're fighting representation of Muslims, we're talking about Islamophobia, misogyny, all these things. And then I suddenly started to notice that nobody was talking about, at least in academia, nobody was talking about how India and Hindus and Hinduism have been misrepresented. At best, they were token references to Mother India or Indiana Jones. Um, but I just wondered why um, we weren't talking about this. And then I noticed that there was obviously this whole other direction that South Asia studies and area studies had gone on, where, to put it in very simple terms, it was almost like Hinduism is sort of the villain, on par with white supremacism, etc., etc. And I found that bewildering because for me, I like for most of us, the color line is a very big part of our lives in the US.
Right.
If you have some relative privileges, being middle class or educated or whatever, the color line is a reality. And so I was really shocked to find the amount of racism in academia and the media that was freely operating the moment it came to the word Hindu. So,
So
and then, yeah.
can I ask on this? So I have a couple questions because I think I kind of want to open it up because I think this is really interesting, right? So when did you start? So when did this? I mean, maybe it's a light bulb, or maybe it was something that was just kind of growing within your mind as you're teaching and doing your studies. But when did you suddenly start noticing the way the media interacted with Hinduism? Was it something that was always there, or was it something that suddenly started picking up on? And actually, I have a couple questions here. I mean, obviously your background is Hindu, and were you like I mean, were you religious beforehand, and was that part of where your consciousness about the media and Hinduism came in, or was it something that kind of just crept up on you?
Wonderful question. Let's just pause. Okay. Yeah. So when did I start noticing that there was perhaps such a thing as anti-Hindu racism and my own sort of identification or
Yeah.
empathy as being Hindu? So it's interesting. In the 90s, I think I did not particularly think of a Hindu identity as such. I mean, I was not very quote unquote religious or anything like that when I came to the US. I mean, obviously, I came from a fairly traditional, devout Orthodox family. But when I came to the US, I think, I mean, I was not an atheist or anything like that. I mean, I kind of believed in God, and occasionally, I would, just think of Ganesha or Saraswati. And also, at that time, at that time and ever since, my parents and I became devotees of Sri Satya Sai Baba. So in the 90s, his presence was also there in my life in the
Yeah.
sense that, um, I thought of him as a guru and as divinity incarnate and everything.
Sure.
For a very long time, it was kind of very complicated in the sense that I just thought of him and religion generally as a small compartment in my mind, where I would kind of just make my, private deals with God so that, I would do well on the SAT or I'll get my visa, this simple everyday stuff. But otherwise, I thought of myself as, just being a modern, global, cosmopolitan person, I guess.
Yeah.
And the first time that started to change a little bit was in the late 90s when I was doing my PhD, because on the one hand, I was reading, Stuart Hall and Foucault and Edward Said and all this amazing literature field. But at the same time, I also started reading Baba's discourses much more seriously. And this was actually, I mean, it sounds trite to say it now, but thanks to the internet. Uh, I remember mid 90s, this new browser came called Netscape, and yeah, I had no idea how to get it connected to the world, but eventually some friends helped me. And then suddenly I realized there was this website, satyasai.org, and they had a lot of Baba's writings online. So I went through this very 4 years where the one reading, essentially, Marxist cultural studies, but at the same time, also reading Baba talking about materiality and accountability and all these things in a very in his own way, the kind of the native, indigenous, grassroots Indian way, I guess. And I found it very fascinating, that all these things, in a sense, were talking about similar things, making a better world, for lack of a better word, making a better place, helping human beings. So I somehow, I think, in my mind, reconciled the critical project of academia and Hinduism, at least the way Baba was embodying it in my own way. But even at that time, I didn't really start thinking about Hindu mass representation as a serious problem. I did notice a few things in the late 90s, and I think since all three of us, and perhaps your viewers also can relate to this time period. Late 90s, if you remember, on music television here in the US, there was quite a lot of Hindu imagery that started. There was, of course, no doubt a little later, Gwen Stefani was in and
Madonna.
Madonna, yeah.
Yeah.
Eros had that Krishna cover with the cat's head.
Right.
So I think basically it was sort of the transition from the old hippie culture to the new, Mac yoga culture that we are inundated with today.
Yeah.
And I was very intrigued by that. On the one hand, I mean, I didn't have any feelings of hostility initially because, after all, I loved the Beatles and George Harrison, and I thought of Western Hinduism as a nice space as well. But then increasingly, I could also see that it wasn't just a few Westerners, borrowing, in a friendly fashion, but there was more and more appropriation taking place, and then there was also this sort of deliberate, uh, almost agenda-based, misrepresentation going on.
Mhm.
And I think I started to notice it, and I began to write about it, at least in a big way, around 2005 or 2005. And that was when this whole California textbook issue sort of broke out in the news. Yeah, I remember reading about it in two or three newspapers. And at first, I still had such a elementary understanding of what was going on, because I looked at the papers and I had this vague image in my mind, these really stern old Indian uncles, going to Sacramento and scolding, these smart professors, and telling them, what you are telling, Ram Lalla was born 30 million years ago. I mean, I just vivid image, because we all see this. We see this in the diaspora, right?
Yeah.
Stern, stodgy old uncles.
That's right.
And so that's and I said, oh man, it was almost like, what are these guys doing? But then again, thanks to internet, all these other articles were coming out, I think, like by Vishal Agarwal and others, and I started to see what was actually in the textbooks.
Mhm.
And at the time, of course, I wasn't a parent, so I mean, school issues weren't really my thing.
Sure.
But started reading more and more about this, I suddenly realized that if these textbooks were this bad, and if academia was resisting changing them so badly, then something was seriously wrong.
Sure.
And I sort of decided to be, whistleblower, and I wrote an op-ed which was published in the San Francisco Chronicle, right opposite with and Thapper's piece. And so that's when my, present engagement, with misrepresentation began.
Okay. Excellent. Racchit, I think you had some questions.
Oh, absolutely. But no, I mean, thank you for that great introduction, Mukunda. I think you really elicited a lot of the things I wanted to touch upon. Professor, I guess let me pick up something that we haven't considered right now. So I love the perspective from which you speak, because most of the other scholars that we've read and speak to, talk from the Indological perspective or from a religious studies perspective. However, there's very few people like you, and I think you're the most prominent one, who's actually picking up this question of representation of Hinduism and Indic culture in general in the media. Could you sort of compare and contrast that, your paradigm, what does this perspective bring to us, to the conversation, right? What value is it bringing us, and, why is this an important piece of the puzzle, in my view? And in fact, I think one of the most important piece of the puzzle, because most other academic writing is sort of stuck in the ivory tower. But I think what you're doing is bridging that gap between academics and a wider audience. And I think this is what you even talk about in your book, Rearming Hinduism, that, hey, it's not quite an academic tome. You kind of gets academic at times, but what you're trying to do is really bridge that gap and, bring it to light that, these are the sort of misrepresentation that goes on in academia and how we might benefit as a culture by addressing it. So could you touch a little bit upon that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the last few years after I wrote Rearming Hinduism, and, I began to read more about, the new Indologists, for lack of a better word, I just realized how little I know. And I think in academia, that's the best thing that can happen to you.
Right.
You suddenly realize, wow, I know so little. And because then after that, you really start to value the knowledge, that's out there. So, but yeah, I think, luckily I often had the clarity, both, the sense of being awed by, these massive historians, like whether it's Sitaram Goel or Dharampal, or more recently, Conrad Elst and, Vishwa Juluri, Bal Gangadhar and many other, independent scholars and others. On the one hand, I do get awed by, their fantastic knowledge. And, but at the same time, I also realize that, for whatever reason, starting with my dropping out of engineering, or maybe coming to America when I was 12 years old and seeing Hare Krishna temple in Berkeley and ending up back there, all these things suddenly make me realize that there is this sort of a space,
Right.
a space in the culture which I seem to have ended up understanding fairly, clearly, and that is, the sort of media, pop culture, everyday life space. And it seems to be very handy right now in talking about it, because one, I think, in the absence of any vast, centralized, organizational apparatus for Hinduism, nothing like the church, or the way it is for quote unquote organized religions. The everyday space is really where what we call Hinduism, keeps playing out. And, and popular culture is a very big part of it. For example, I think many of our generation's ideas about Hinduism, particularly in India, came from Amar Chitrakala.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
I mean, that was an amazing universe. So now when I see people debating about Amar Chitrakala causing fascism and stuff like that, I mean, I'm so amused, because in the early 70s, when you were growing up in essentially a quasi-socialist India, the emergency was going on. I mean, twice a month you would see Krishna, or you would see, the Bhakti saints, and you will see a better world. It wasn't just golden age nostalgia for the past. It was the liberalism of these stories, that appealed to us in that particular generation, So I think like Amar Chitragada, like the mythological movies, pop culture has been a very living source of our ideas of Hinduism for us. And then the other, I think, interesting thing that's becoming relevant is the fact that the media itself has become more colonizing and totalitarian in its nature, right? In the 70s, you just had movies and comics and maybe Doordarshan. By the 90s, you had satellite TV 24/7. And now we have the phone, can't live with it or without it. And I mean, the way people are getting inundated and overwhelmed with these very calculated messages, which are demonizing a whole group of people, the people of color, post-colonial people. That has turned into, I think, something like a burning problem, at least in the. So what I've been trying to do, I mean, rearming sort of a very strange multi-genre experiment. I mean, I wrote it in just 3 or 4 weeks. Partly it was critique, partly it was just like a song from the heart, a song of pain and hope. But since then, I think what I'm realizing more and more is the need for a systematic study of Hindu misrepresentation in the media. And so next spring, I'm most likely going to be teaching a senior seminar on how Hindus are depicted in the media. And so usually when I'm able to teach something in a class, that also helps me with my writing and putting a book together. But I think yes, whether it's resisting propaganda, I can call it genocidal, proto-genocidal propaganda, in terms of resisting that, and in terms of self-representation. I mean, Hinduism is so much about the art, the beauty of sculpture, of storytelling, of song. So in both ways, it seems like we are going through the media yuga or media sub-yuga in Sanatan Dharma. So
Yeah.
I'm glad to be,
Racchit, you got follow-up?
No, nothing. Go ahead. Thank you so much.
So, Professor, so I think you started touching on a few points, and I think I kind of want to press this is, okay, so both the West and say Western media generally, just speaking, like America and Europe and whatever, and then in some part the English-speaking Indian media, right, it has a certain very unique view of what Hinduism and Hindus mean, right? Like, for example, like from the past few years, there's been this long conversation about, is yoga Hindu or is it something else, and anytime they talk about Hinduism or any of the branches that touch upon it, there's always negative tinge. Like anything you want to assign that's good, for example, yoga, oh, maybe it's not Hindu. Anything that ends up being bad, like caste, oh, that has to be, that's the core of Hinduism. Where do you see that play out, and can you describe like why you think it plays out the way it does, and how it does play out in both the Western media and kind of like English-speaking Indian media?
Yeah, I think again, when I first started to notice this, it was utterly mystifying to me.
Yeah.
That essentially, when I look at Hindu people, especially here in the US, sure, there are a few doctors and engineers who are wealthy, but most Hindus are middle class or working class, and we've all gone through challenges, on the color line, on the class line, and yet I somehow found it very strange that academics, particularly from the South Asian community, suddenly decided that Hinduism was sort of like whiteness. It was a dominant construct. And I remember the 90s, one of the most influential books in South Asia studies, South Asian American studies, was The Karma of Brown Folks by Vijay Prashad. And it's almost like a Bible, I think, for many young scholars. And I can understand the kind of meaning and hope it gave to many young South Asian youth in the US at that time. But when you read that carefully, you find, he starts with a discussion of anti-immigration racism in the US in the 20s and 30s, the Catherine Mayo, all that. And then by the time it comes to the 70s, suddenly, he switches tracks and the problem becomes what he calls Yankee Hindutva, and he just talks about that and for the rest of the book. And even in his later book, Uncle Swami, there's this whole post 9/11, Islamophobia he's talking about. And there too, again, there's just like this passing reference about the textbook issue and things like that. For the most part, again, what we see happening inside academia is this construction that Hinduism is innately oppressive, dominant, etc. And it's full of contradictions. And I remember when the 2016, tech issue played out again, the entire paradigm in academia today, the dominant paradigm, uh, you know, came forth in the form of a letter. Uh, that letter, basically summarized how academia is thinking about Hinduism today. One, there is no such thing as Hinduism, and by implication, if you call yourself Hindu, you're something called a Hindu nationalist. You hate Muslims, you worship Hitler. There's like a whole package of positions that are attributed to you. And then at the same time, even though there is supposedly no Hinduism, the caste system is Hinduism and it's innately patriarchal, oppressive, etc. Now, the weird thing I think over here, what has happened is this is essentially a colonial imagination that is playing out over here. I mean, this is more or less what the white people who were ruling India, 100, years ago were thinking. And the reason I think it's been so persistent is because academics and then by extension people in the media have not challenged it. The way in this almost every community challenged the dominant paradigm. In India, the intellectual elite in the media, in academia, and so on, just got absorbed into the dominant paradigm, and they sort of made this sort of a semi-strawman figure, like Hindutva, to kind of become the dominant concern. I mean, I can understand the contextual critique of politics in India there, but that's not what is going on. It's wholesale demonization of Hinduism. So one of the changes I want to actually highlight, I would say till the U.S. media story on Hinduism was always pretty black and white and bad. So you can say Catherine Mayo's Mother India in the 20s, which as late as the 50s, surveys found was the single most influential book on India in the US. Okay, and that was like outright xenophobic, eugenics, crazy Nazi style stuff. I mean, she's saying Hindus stink, and Hindus are festering sources of disease and are a weaker race and are genetic, whatever genetic detritus. So I mean, it's an outright racist book. But the similar ideas in Mother India are still being played out to this day. Now in the West, I think it was a very quick, seamless transition because as Stuart Hall and Edward Said have told us, the way racism operates in the media is simply through what Said calls a restorative citation of antecedent authority, or Hall puts it more simply, he says the old racist movies keep getting made again and again.
Yeah.
So you have the old Catherine Mayo colonial, essentially Christian, religious, supremacist, racist vision of Hindus playing out again in a slightly softer form in Indiana Jones in the 80s, and again in Slumdog Millionaire, in the New York Times, with its very one-sided reporting. All this stuff is going on. Now, what has happened in India is actually, I think, even more alarming. There was a fairly strong, quote-unquote, secular element in the Indian Anglophone media, which sort of viewed the Hindu culture with some suspicion, and the Hindu nationalist or the BJP and the political part with a lot of opposition. And that was the case right from the 80s, I would say, till the early 2000s or so. But my informal sense is till around 2014, perhaps, the Indian media was not virulently anti-Hindu on the same scale as was the case here. To give you a simple example, I mean, I could get published in India. I mean, I had a column in the Indian Express. The Hindu used to publish me in the Times of India. My books were, and well, some of them still are, published by well-known mainstream publishers in India. But what started to happen, I think, post 2014, was this sudden normalization of extreme Hindu hatred and falsehood as factual reporting, as factual, acceptable discourse on Hinduism. And that is very alarming. And they've completely shut down anything like positive self-representations of Hinduism. And I think that's happened for a couple of reasons. One might be political, economic. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and how the media as a global big business operates. But it's also happening, I think, within the institutions of journalism in a generational level. So what we're noticing more and more now with Indian journalists, for example, is how clueless they are about the world around them. Okay, so you have Indian journalists, for example, who talk about the ordinary, harmless Hindu parts of Indian life, not even Hindu life, sometimes Indian life, like rasam, you
Yeah.
know, or rasam soup, like my American friends call it. Uh, I am amazed. If you remember the Scroll, an Indian website had an article on how rasam is a site of Brahmanism. And then
Oh,
they put
yes.
that
Oh, I
article.
remember that. Yes.
And so you have the New York Times, of course, here you're doing a piece on South. So you have this whole weird thing where just normal, apolitical, spiritual, cultural Hinduism is suddenly, turned into a monster. And some of it is happening, I think, because of a generational change where you have this sort of a deracinated Indian Anglophone elite, which has no idea. The other example you might recall, there was a professor in India who wrote on Facebook about the quote unquote angry Hanuman uh,
Yes.
of
Yes.
culture, right? So
Yes.
now it's interesting if you take that as a case study. Okay, so if you recall, in India a couple of years ago, a lot of taxi drivers, bus drivers, auto drivers started putting this, nice, intense, brooding red picture of Hanuman.
It was a decal. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like decal. They would put it on the window, and I mean, Hanuman didn't look particularly malicious, frankly. I mean, he looked a little intense and brooding, but nothing like it wasn't really a pop culture Hanuman where he's looking like a robot or something. I mean, it was still. I thought it was within the range of Hindu sensibilities, but
Yeah.
anyway, and it starts to become very popular. Then the media does a interview with him where they give this catchy phrase, "Angry Hanuman."
Yeah.
Now, the artist, I forget his name, I think he was from Mangalore, he clearly said, look, my Hanuman is not angry, I call it attitude. So, attitude is a popular phrase among young Indians. It started from the Channel V days. And what he means is this is Hanuman who's sort of, confident or assertive, but not necessarily aggressive or angry.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. The media completely decided to label this as angry Hanuman. Okay. Anyway, so now angry Hanuman becomes a thing, and people are talking about it. And then this professor in Delhi talks about how this angry Hanuman is such a disturbing phenomenon, considering how, and this is her quote, Hanuman used to be a cute dimwit.
Oh my
I mean, what on
goodness.
is a cute dimwit Hanuman? I mean, what world have these people grown up in?
Right.
And now it gets even worse. Now, this professor also goes on to say um, that Hanuman was, this quote unquote cute dimwit who accidentally set Lanka on fire with his tail. So, I mean, how can you grow up in a world where you have no clue how, the rest of your people and not just your family, but even your servants, and the people in the slums, the common people of India, what is in their minds when they think of Hanumanji,
Yeah.
and his episodes, whether you want to think of it as real or fiction or something in between. The fact is, there's a broad, even though there may be many different versions of the Ramayana and Hanuman, etc., there is a broad sense of things he did and didn't do. And for a professor to kind of just decide that this is it, jump off a like months, this is not incredible jump like Hanuman going to Sri Lanka. This is par for the course now with Hinduphobia. You recall the American professor Audrey Truschke?
Yeah.
Oh yes, absolutely.
He sounds off one day about how something like Rama is a quote unquote chauvinist pig, and and then even Robert Goldman, who's considered one of the authorities on Ramayana in the West, he says, that's not an accurate translation. There's no such thing at all. But nonetheless, so I think this is what has gone on now. Innocuous things are demonized as being violent, and then Hindu sensibilities are completely trashed by the small clique of completely clueless and at times, virulently hateful ivory tower personalities. So I think that is the very, very scary proto-genocidal terrain we are living with today.
Absolutely. Racchit, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of comments. So this is something, Professor, relate to, what you said in your Rearming Hinduism book. This regards Hanuman. Can really view his disposition in that, little decal as being more Raudra rather than Krodha, right? So he's not an angry Hanuman. He's just in his, more terrific form, which is something that is, there in our text. If any of these scholars, who talk about Hanuman are actually willing to read them. There's definitely another thing, and I think you touched upon it, right? Is this whole disposition in the media of these, I think as you called it, deracinated Anglophone elite. Now, I unfortunately kind of grew up with some of them, so I was in Dehradun. I went to the Doon School, and as you know, right, a lot of Indian journalism is dominated by people from there. So growing up, right, in high school, that was me. And, a lot of these views were just something that I had internalized. And it's really coming to America where I kind of went through, you could say, a quasi-identity crisis in the sense that I started questioning, well, who am I, right? And it was really the color line that I experienced when I came to America. In fact, I'd say this, for the first 6 months of my freshman year, I wasn't conscious of color. In my second semester of my freshman year, I actually became conscious of color as a thing. And now it's sort of, become part of my psyche now, living in America. So it's very interesting, and, maybe at some time I can write a little blog post on that experience. But yeah, this internalized self-hatred that a lot of the elite in India have is very disturbing. I have these regular conversations with a lot of my friends and colleagues who I grew up with, who had seen me when I was growing up, and now they look at me as someone who's not really like a devout Hindu, but someone who actually practices the culture and in actually being a Hindu, and they will equate that with Hindutva, right? Just like you said, so anything that we do, because you come from such as a family or because you're Hindu, so anything you're doing is Hindutva. While someone like Audrey Trusky, even though she comes from a family of evangelical priests, but she's got no hidden agenda. I have an agenda, you have an agenda, Mukunda has an agenda, but Audrey does not have an agenda. And that to me is just shocking, that whole the attitude that people have.
And just to jump off that real quick, I mean, you recall, Professor, when the Sabrimala issue was coming up, right? It was recast as an issue of feminism, as opposed to understanding that it has nothing to do with feminism or administration per se, because there's other temples across India. Like the mass media, whenever like T.M. Krishna would write an article or this person would write an article, it would never talk about the nuanced view of the hundreds of temples, thousands of temples in India. Only a few here and there have restrictions about who can come in, who can go out. And Sabrimala is one of them, right? So instead of saying it as this is all about like a particular temple and their rituals and their needs of that deity, this is Hinduism. It's misogynism for Hinduism. We're anti-feminist. We're this, that, and it was blown up not only in the Indian media but all over the West. And so I mean, how so what is it that when you do your research and studies on this, how do you approach these kind of issues, and how do you make it so that people can try to understand the inherent bias that exists? And because a lot of times because we're so covered in it, like it's sometimes difficult to see we're actually sitting in the muck. We sometimes are like, oh no, that's just the way it is, as opposed to saying we're in the muck.
Indeed, yeah. There are times when I end up writing every day, either an article or a post or at least a tweet, because this has been incessant. And there are times when I almost just decide, I can't be doing this every day, because it's one of the big disappointments I think has been the absence within the Hindu community of any kind of an organized awareness or a professional response to all of this. I mean, all that's been happening is those of us who are doing it, out of a sense of seva, I guess,
Yeah.
podcasts or talks and, blogs and things like that. And, and the other problem is there's so much noise, even within our community. There's a lot of anger which just, goes all in all directions on the internet. And, it's almost like every single Hindu has been presented the bill for essentially a political party's, actions or even their alleged actions in India.
Right.
And then obviously there is this gap between Hindus around the world and this party which supposedly speaks in its name. So I think the last few years have become extremely troubling because on the one hand you have this political churn going on in India, which has turned into an excuse for a cultural extinction program. It looks like, and the challenge I think is that many people from our own families and peer circles and professions have failed to understand or empathize with the pain that many of us are feeling right now. And like Racchit was saying, I mean, most Indian elites today grew up in this whole Doon school, Saint Stephen's kind of atmosphere. And I think what has happened is, they have accepted sort of this consumer pill of what it means to be a good human being, namely secular, etc., without any critical thinking.
Mm.
That they basically that they are turning into the monster that they read about in Arundhati Roy's books, for example. I mean, they are embodying capitalist power in the U.S. They are, taking forward these big Western media corporations like Netflix or New York Times or whatever, and they're ramming that into the minds and lives of people in India, who like poor, people and like most people, have don't know how to argue or fight back, so they go to these schools, they internalize all this propaganda. So it's I think a really complex and intense, generational, epistemic, cultural, social, political battle, that's going on. And underlying all of this is, of course, the environmental battle.
Yeah.
I mean, what is going on with the amount of plastic everywhere, with the amount of deforestation, tree cutting going on in India, and when is Hinduism going to come back as a force to just put this idea back? I know put the fear of God may not be a very Hindu expression.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it's but I know. I mean, look. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, people would hesitate before cutting a tree because some granny from the village or the slum would come and say, no, no, that goddess is to you. Cut it.
But it wasn't a fear, right? That was more of a respect. There's this inherent, like,
Yeah.
it's this, like, I'm at a loss for words, but it really is a respect for things. Like no one fears. People don't kick a Shivalingam or a deity out of fear. You do it out of respect because people know that the Murti is not going to attack you or nothing's going to happen, but they know that there's karma, right? The whole idea of karma is the regulating the boundary of our network. Is this, if I'm harming this living creature like a tree or whatever, there should be a good reason where I can deal with the karmic consequence of it, as opposed to just cutting it down so some corporation can build another factory, right?
Exactly. I think it's like, the whole traditional episteme of reverence, love for nature, all these things, the love for the gods.
Yeah.
That has been violently erased by the whole, post-colonial education, by the media and so on. And there's nothing really to replace it because the Indian elites who own, essentially all the machinery of consciousness, the media and schools and colleges and everything, I mean, they don't have a vision, so it's like, they're just repeating what is being said over here, in the US
Yeah.
context. And they're just perpetuating this bizarre lie again that, Hindus are like the KKK of India. I mean, just think of the word lynching, for example, and trying to make this equation that Muslims are the blacks of India. I mean, I didn't see blacks ruling America for 1,000 years or
Yeah.
trying to force. I mean, the equivalence is just not there. So I think, yeah, we do have a huge communication crisis, ironically, at a time when there's more and more communication available.
Yeah. Racchit?
Yeah, Professor, I'm happy you brought this whole, discussion about the environment and nature. This is something I feel strongly about too, right? You give that anecdote about the granny coming and saying, "Hey, don't cut down a tree." So I come from Uttarakhand, right? We're the land of the Chipko movement. That's where it started. And so for us, growing up, I mean, the respect that we have for our mountains, the Himalayas, for the forests, I mean, it was just something deeply ingrained. It's almost a very animistic culture, but that's what allowed us to preserve the land to such a level that people want to visit today. And one thing that breaks my heart is that I see all these news reports coming out of pictures of because of increased tourism from the plains. The mountains are becoming very dirty. The rivers, even at their source now, are becoming dirty. Until very recently, the Ganga was clean all the way up to Rishikesh and Haridwar. And now, unfortunately, people are coming and they're not respecting the beliefs of the locals and the culture of the locals, and not treating the mountains and the forest with respect. And that's leading to a whole lot of destruction. And it's very sad that anytime we express this love and reverence for nature as something divine and pure, it's belittled by the Anglophone elite, saying that, oh, this is a more primitive culture, this is just nature worship. And I say, you know what, if you're being a true rationalist, this abstracts notions of God, that's something that we can't relate to with our senses. But to have this reverence for quote unquote divinity in the nature around us, something we can view and interact with, to me should be the most rational form of religion, if anything at all. So I do think a renewed focus on those the more natural aspects of Indian and Hindu culture would lead to a much better situation in India, and I think, as you said in your book, would just be better for the world as a whole.
So I just want to. I know we don't have that much time, so I want to touch on a few more topics before we talk about your books. So we recently had in May the largest election in human history, right, in India, in which you had almost 1 billion people actually coming out to vote and putting into power what is the BJP government, but has been deemed fascist, nationalist, like a terrible thing for the universe, as if like Hiranyakashipu Ravana himself has taken like a seat in India. And my concern is, so my question to you is, I'm sure you've been following, and I've been following your posts and your tweets. There is clearly an agenda sitting out here in the back, right? I'm not saying it's a conspiracy theory. I'm not saying it's any of that, but there's a clear agenda in the way they approach even the idea of nationalism within India and the idea of like even the BJP. Could you like speak to that as to what how this election was viewed both internally within India and by the outside of India, and like the problems that you see in the representation that the Hindutva has had on the whole?
Yeah, I mean, the coverage was incredibly one-sided, narrow, and yeah, seemingly agenda-driven. And I mean, very simply, we hardly saw any Western publications presenting any arguments contradicting their sort of dominant, that this was again a choice between the survival of India as a secular republic where all people could live peacefully together, as envisioned by the founding fathers, quote unquote, Nehru and his children and grandchildren and great grandchildren. I'm being ironic there because you probably noticed a new Washington Post headline, India's founding dynasty, a reference to Rahul Gandhi. So, but that was the assumption, essentially, that India was as this secular republic by Nehru and the Congress Party, and Modi is a part of this part of this Hindu extremist Hindu Wahhabi thing. And, India is not going to survive. India is going to turn into that show I have not seen yet, Layla or whatever, where there's going to be, this obsession, Aryan purity. And so, I mean, it was a very bizarre paradigm that was being peddled, the last few months. And there was very little debate allowed at the New York Times or NPR, etc., on other things that are going on. I mean, they simply didn't publish any views, as simple as that. Now, what exactly were they trying to say, and what were the, journalistic uh, shortcomings? It's very, very simple. I've written several pieces in Medium on this, but one of the things that we find, which is really weird, is how hard they tried to dehumanize Hindus. So they would always be the Hindu mob, or descriptions of an angry mob. And the mob, the language they use for Hindus, it's very interesting. It's very similar to the kind of language that old colonizers used, for the Native Americans. The mob howling, it's screaming. It's like one huge entity. It has no individual characteristics. And by contrast, many reports in Washington Post, NPR, etc., begin with one frail Muslim mentioned by name, right? And there was a phrase like his voice drops to a whisper that I actually found in 2 or 3 newspapers. So
Mhm.
it's like they've got this performance going, so where they want to talk about the Muslim they write about as an individual human being who's so scared, his voice drops to a whisper, and then the rest of India is just one amorphous mob, and it affected in very very uh, deep ways. For example, when they NPR had reported about the changing of Allahabad's name,
Mhm.
nowhere did they mention that there was a Hindu existence and a Hindu name before it was called Allahabad.
Yeah.
So it's almost like this South Asia paradigm, which was floated by a group of academics in 2016 in the textbook debate, got printed in the media in all these months. Now, as going to the elections itself, uh, well, I mean, I think clearly the people in India don't believe this kind of propaganda, and they see Modi as I think, a good and capable person. And obviously, different people see him in different ways. I think urban middle classes, some of them probably see him as a more secular, person who's a devout personal Hindu, but more secular in his operations, and that's
Mhm.
fine. Maybe some of the youth, small town youth, etc., they think of him as a Hindu warrior. I don't know. So this politics is a big theater, and I know it again since my mom used to be in politics. But and different constituencies probably see him in different ways. But I think the real concern now is essentially, and this is where I think being a critical scholar helps, because the question I have to ask now is, what is the nature of power going forward in India? Okay, so there was a big fight where the old systems of power were sort of shaken down, and this completely new group of people, namely the RSS, to put it
Right.
very bluntly, has one political power. So what are they going to do next? And they're driven, I think, not by exclusivist Hindu extremism. That's a myth, as most people know. Uh, but they are driven by their own ideology, which is not Hindu theocracy either. It's their own sense of service and patriotism and things like that. And I think presently many of them are well intentioned, but do they have the frameworks for dealing with the nature of post colonial power?
Sure.
Or, as somebody tweeted today, are they just going to end up becoming the, the old regime in another form?
Right.
Where you have this idealized version of what the Congress probably wanted to be in the 40s and 50s, but not as corrupt and somewhat patriotic, and they do that for a few years. But meantime, the discourse on Hinduism, the delegitimization of Hindu existence itself, has gone into catastrophic proportions.
Sure.
And this government simply does not seem to know what to do, and that's a fact. The last 5 years they didn't know what to do, and I mean, some might say it's too soon to say, but I mean, I think they have internalized, the present lay of the land, and where they're essentially selling, take Sabrimala for example, so they have internalized this idea that Hinduism is in need of reform, right? For example, another example, 2 years ago, or was it last year, they had that big gathering, in Chicago. It was supposed to be called, I think, Gathering for Hindu Unity or something. So many of the political figures here were, associated with it, I guess. And then the web for that gathering, um, it was all about celebrating how successful and
In the U.S., you mean?
You want to in the U.S., yeah. Okay, I mean, you want to say that, if it makes you feel good, say it. But then there was nothing on the website on the agenda about Hinduphobia, about what Hindus face as a result of racism. Whereas they do have stuff about how Hinduism needs to reform. So I think this dominant paradigm has become internalized even by the people who were supposed to be the resistance, or at least one part of the resistance.
Sure.
So I think the political landscape in India is just very, very convoluted right now, and I think we have to start thinking about a more detached Hindu movement, which can't be reduced to just politics.
Sure. Racchit, I'm sure you have some comments or questions.
Oh, well, yeah, just just a question in this case. So since we're on the topic of elections, Professor, if I recall correctly, you wrote Rearming Hinduism in the backdrop of the 2014 elections. And now that Modi's gotten re-elected, are you thinking of maybe like a Rearming Hinduism redux? Because also there's something you mentioned earlier about now, since you've written that book, your mind is open to like so many other, so much great work happening by other Indologists. So is this something maybe you want to revisit and talk about the path forward? And if not, then maybe we could kind of segue into talking about some of the other books.
Yeah, actually, both the questions were segued into my books. This one and the one. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting. So, Rearming Hinduism, I wrote it in a very strange way because I had an appendectomy in 2014, and I wrote it in 3-4 weeks while I was recovering. I think the immediate provocation, in a sense, was the Wendy Doniger controversy.
Yes.
And then, of course, the Modi election took place, and I felt very optimistic because, from 2002 till about 2013, I had very little understanding of who Modi was and what the RSS was, frankly. I mean, I think I was just sort of assuming whatever they said in the Western media. And it's only around 2013, 14 when I started listening, but I suddenly realized this guy's Gandhian and Hind Swaraj kind of sensibility and all that. But anyway, so I think, I mean, I do have a couple of ideas I'm working on right now. One is an academic, study of Hindu depictions, particularly here in the U.S. media, because as you know, I mean, Hinduphobia is also becoming an issue in the U.S. elections.
Absolutely.
With Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi, yeah.
The attacks on Tulsi, and so I think it's going to be very important to talk more about Hinduphobia in the US in the next couple of years. And I don't know, I mean, honestly, a book on Hindu politics in India is not something I feel like doing right now.
Right.
Because I mean, my optimism has been somewhat knocked out in the last few. But I am probably, I've been thinking about a lot of different creative ideas, in terms of Hinduism and intergenerational communication. So something about, that brings in all this wonderful books I've been reading by Vishwa and others the last few years, that brings it to a broader audience. So those are, I think, two of the Hinduism nonfiction projects, I have going right now. And of course, the other big thing on my table is, this goes back to Dehradun and Uttarakhand, the question of nature, and for me, the Kishkinda Chronicles, the series on Hanuman, was and is about nature, and nature at breaking point.
So let's talk about actually. So what was the inspiration for you to write? First of all, the larger Kishkinda Chronicles, and then the Saraswati's Intelligence.
All right. So I got this idea around 2013 or so, and I wanted to sort of write this epic reimagining of Hanuman. And I must share that certainly a big part of the inspiration was Amesh's Shiva trilogy.
Sure.
Because what I found fascinating, it's actually very interesting. I read The Immortals of Miluha, I think in 2011 or 12.
Yeah.
And then I also heard Amish speaking, I think at the Jaipur Lit Fest or some other Lit Fest, and I was looking at how people in the audience were responding to him. And then in 2013, when Modi's prime minister run was sort of becoming more and more mainstream,
yeah,
I started noticing that people were in all these comment boards.
Yeah.
I started noticing that there was this kind of a convergence where people seemed to be talking about Amish's books and also Modi at the same time. It is very uncanny, but so in a way, it was Amish's fans who first taught me that Modi ji was not a fascist.
That's interesting.
Strange, but then suddenly this idea started occurring to me, and then of course I started listening to his speeches, and then later I read Deen Dayal and Conrad, and so I got a better picture. But anyway, so yeah, the first inspiration was Amish's Shiva books.
Yeah.
And basically what I found interesting was how you could tell your own story. It didn't have to be just another version of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. You could tell a completely different story where you had fun with it, you had an adventure story, but then you kind of still reconstructed the moral universe in a way that was consistent with the basic expectations and sensibilities you have.
Sure.
So, for example, with Hanuman, you couldn't have Hanuman as as a playboy. Simple as that.
Yeah.
In my book, Hanuman would still be treated with respect about being a brahmachari and all those things. So with those kind of things, I began thinking about this book in 2013, and my father encouraged me a great deal. But my father was a professor of zoology, and I remember him telling me about Jwalapuram, this village in Andhra Pradesh, where the ash from the Toba volcano in 70,000 BC had settled there, and so all these things started making me think about prehistory. So I started reading a little bit about Old Dubai and Africa, and I went and got a whole lot of nice picture books with lots of caveman paintings and dinosaur paintings, and and then the other angle that was also relevant was, I think, Hampi. Hampi is also on the cover of Riyami Hinduism. In 2005, I visited Hampi for the first time with my students, and it was actually a really life-changing experience. And I think, along with all the other things which made me want to write about Hinduism, I think actually seeing Hampi was a profoundly transformative experience. And I should also mention 9 Days in Kishkinda, a short travel memoir last year. Just about going back to Hampi again, this time with my wife and son. And basically, I wanted to chant this mantra, to Yantrodharaka Hanuman, because I found a recording. In 2014, my father passed away.
I'm sorry.
In 2017, I found a recording of my father chanting that mantra. So end of that year, we went back to Hampi, to that particular temple, and because I wanted to hear my father's voice chanting that in that temple.
Oh, that's very nice.
Yeah, so I think, so there is this, not just a broader, but a deeper thing going on with Hanuman as a context, to the Kishkinda Chronicles. So I'm going back and forth a little bit here, but, so 2013, I wrote Saraswati's Intelligence, and I wrote part one, and I really enjoyed writing it. I
Yeah.
wrote it quickly, and it was the first time I was writing action, which was completely new to me. And anyway, so I had fun writing it. Then I was going to write part two and three, but then a lot of things changed in my life. My father's passing, and then I wrote Rearming Hinduism. Then so three, and then I had this voice issue. So like literally 3-4 years passed, and Saraswati's Intelligence came out, and readers were asking me when part two is coming, and I was really stuck because I had to write part two, and well, 4 years had passed. So anyway, so finally last year, 2018, I did write part two, and it turned out very well. So as a reader of Saraswati's Intelligence, I think you'll enjoy this one.
And when's
So
that
the
coming out?
part two, hopefully by the end of this year,
Okay.
and Westland will be publishing it as well. And part two is
I have
called.
Saraswati's Intelligence here, I think. I have a really good cover. I love the cover of it. Should have it here. Or it's in my other book. It's probably in my other bookshelf, but I have it, and I love the cover. It's fantastic. I don't know who you got to do the art, but it looks amazing.
Yeah, so the artist was, I think, one of Westland's cover artists, and it was a great vision he had. He had this kind of almost like I think, a East Asian Hanuman. I like
Yeah.
that sleek look, and very very lean and almost manga type, and
Yeah.
but at the same time, the landscape and everything was very primordial. Yeah, so book two is called the Fire Keepers of Jwalapuram. So I wanted to honor Jwalapuram and my father and Professor Korisetar, the archaeologist.
So I know you didn't put any timetable on in the like the chronology of the book, right? So from what I thought, and this is, you could totally tell me I was wrong. I thought this was probably like something like 25,000 BCE kind of like story, like when human civilization was starting to kind of rise along with the monkey civilization and all these, and that's where I thought, but maybe you're writing for a time well before that.
Well, actually, you're not too far off the mark. Basically, I mean, because it's fiction, we do take a lot of liberties. But if I had to think of a date, I would probably think 70,000 BC.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because there is the volcano angle that also connects to the story.
Sure. I mean, I don't want you to spoil anything because it's that's part of the part of reading the book.
Yeah. So there's a
but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really liked. I think you did a great job in especially describing like sceneries. Like I loved how you described the jungles and kind of give very even the way you described the animals within the forest and their relationships was actually very. It's very nice, and it's actually, I mean, obviously it's a lot of anthropomorphizing them, but nonetheless, it's just really, it's a great way to build that relationship. I think from what I assume you're going to do with the story is like eventually connect to the Ramayana, because he had all this period of time to where you don't know Hanuman's origin outside of like his birth and then like his whatever. There's so much else that you filled in between, and like the relationships between the various Vanaras was actually kind of interesting.
Thank you. I think the different levels at which the writing fiction of this kind operates. There is, at the core of it, I think there is a sort of maybe a moral intellectual vision that inevitably happens.
Yes.
Because when you're also an academic and you write nonfiction, but you want to express that naturally, without getting pedantic about it.
Yeah.
And there is the landscapes, the nature, and of course the characters. So I think the 3-4 characters, just express themselves very nicely. Particularly the relationship of Sugriva to his mother and to his brother.
Yeah.
Because of the sibling conflict there, and then of course the rishis.
Yes.
And Vaishnavi, sort of a very skilled and brave, queen.
Right.
So I think book two, you'll definitely enjoy reading it because it picks up where it left off with a cliffhanger.
You did have that. I mean, am I allowed to say like part of the story or no, or would you not rather me not?
Okay, your choice. I mean, can you edit it out if it's too revealing?
No, I think it's a really cool thing you did with one of the characters in Ramayana and how they meet Avali. That was really interesting because I mean that's so. Anyways, I'll just say that I enjoyed that scene. I really enjoyed that interaction. So yeah. And then you have a new book coming out aside from the Kishkinda series too, right? You have another book you're writing.
Yeah. So actually, the writing book, is that what you want to do?
Yes. No, I
Yeah.
thought you have another book outside the part two to Kishkinda. You actually have another book you're also working on?
Well, the Hinduphobia book.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that will be. Actually, let me just say one more thing about Kishkinda. Sorry,
Sure, sure.
if you can just put it there. This sort of goes back to Racchit's question as well, and Uttarakhand. So, while my interest, was inspired by Amish and telling the story about Hanuman, I
Yeah.
think core idea that I really wanted to explore, in the Kishkinda Chronicles, was this what you mentioned of speciesism,
Yeah.
of what today we would call human-animal relations, and I was really trying to think of a time when this kind of a mental barrier between humans and non-humans did not exist. Because I think much of Hindu thought and culture expresses, such a sensibility, where you think, the same, these are all jivis, and you
Yeah.
don't have the sort of a dominion idea that, trees and animals are just objects put there for you to, consume. Um, so, I think that's why this whole idea of Paramadharma, uh, which of course is ahimsa,
Yeah.
uh, is a big part of the book. And then book 2 and 3, I think I explore it some more, in terms of, how it all unfolds.
Sure.
So one interesting teaser I can share from book 2 is, so in book 2, there's going to be a competing idea being imposed on Kishkinda, and that's called Pragati Dharma.
Prakriti Dharma.
So Pragati Dharma, progress. So we're going to kind of a clash between the old ideology of Paramadharma and this new ascendant ideology of Pragati Dharma.
Interesting.
And yeah, so I think that's hopefully going to go to the hearts of everyone who's seen what's happened to, the mountains of Uttarakhand or even the boulders of Hyderabad.
Yeah.
And the rivers and the trees. Yeah, because it's catastrophic again, what's going on. And, hopefully these words will encourage people to save whatever little is left.
Sure. That sounds amazing. I'm excited to read part 2 and see where you go with the story on this and ideas. Racchit, do you have anything?
Nothing. I have not read this series, but I eagerly await the release of the second part because I love to binge books, so I'd rather just read it all in a stretch. So yeah, I'm going to wait until later this year when it's out. That's it. Thank you.
And then so the Hinduphobia book you're also working on, and that's when do you plan on having that come out?
Yeah, so the Hinduphobia book is, I had a couple of versions I wrote a couple of years ago, and but now I've gone back to the writing table on that because I'm trying to make it more data-based. And at the moment I'm just collecting data, like what's all the things that New York Times has said about Hindus or the Guardian.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean it might take a year or so, I think, before I manage to put it all together because there's just so much that nobody in my field has done until now. But I do want to try and finish it by next year because again, and this would be appropriate because we began our conversation with the American Dream in the Berkeley Hare Krishna Temple. I think we're already seeing this very fascinating thing happening with Tulsi's run.
Right.
And so I think people here, a lot of the people who call themselves progressives and liberals in the US,
Yeah.
particularly in academia, really need to own up to the fact that Hinduphobia too is a form of racism.
Sure.
And if you're
Absolutely.
against racism, if you oppose the way Obama was insulted and smeared, you also need to understand, what's happening to Tulsi. Whether you support her or not, you need to understand what's happening. Tulsi is what's happening to Hindus in this country.
And I think.
And I mean, to put it very.
Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, to put it very simply, I was reading this little book which called what's it called? Something about white people, Dear White People.
Oh.
Right. So I think we need a kind of a Dear White People or Dear Hinduphobes, guide, for white people particularly, and also for some of the brown people we count among our own friends and family.
Right.
Because a very weird thing has happened. You see this whole phenomenon now of the word Hindu making it okay for white people to be racist with you, at least in academia.
Right.
And it's a very, very weird thing. Whether it's Audrey Trusch or the editor of Mother Jones magazine, who wrote on Twitter about how, quote unquote, as she put it, these Brahmin.
Yes, this is shocking.
Yeah, these Brahmin come to Silicon Valley, using affirmative action, and then they deny it to people in India. You remember that?
It was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it just, as someone who works in even technology, totally denigrates all the hard work Indians have had to put in to rise up. I mean, I had uncles in the tech industry in the 80s who actually faced the bamboo ceiling, because of the racism that was there. But in spite of the hard work, rose to the higher echelons of management. And luckily today they've broken through, and, Microsoft and Google is actually led by Indians. It's a pretty amazing thing. But if you look at the backgrounds of all these people, they weren't from very rich, powerful families in India. They were just middle class families and just worked really hard. And in spite of all the affirmative action in India, they got into the top schools because they were brilliant. I mean, if anything, we should be congratulating them on their success.
I mean, but the thing I think the Mother Jones article didn't also understand is they left India for that reason too. They left India because it's incredibly difficult for a Brahmin or upper caste, whatever you want to call it, with good credentials to do much, right? Outside of, I mean, now it's changed because of a lot more. When they opened up the markets, it became much more. Private industry was quick to pick up that talent. But before, in like the 80s and 70s and 60s, that's why everyone came to the U.S. My parents came, my father came here. One of the reasons is because it's difficult as a Brahmin with a good education to get a job. You'll be given to someone else that caste hierarchy.
Yeah, see, I think what has happened is, again, it's all of this kind of extreme racism, which which white people not do against any people of color, where they suddenly start pretending that if you're quote unquote upper caste, then you're somehow white, so we can try and civilizing you, which is bullshit.
Yeah.
And
100% bullshit.
all, yeah. So now here's a very interesting thing. I think this is the core of the lie that is starting to get unpacked now. And the most important work here again is Vamsee Juluri's book, The Nayside, because this entire discourse on somehow upper caste Hindus being like white supremacists or the KKK of India and all that, it's actually 19th century German anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Yes. It's Nazi racism being put onto brown people by so-called progressives like the editor of Mother Jones magazine.
Right.
So, and the wonderful phrase that Vishwa has in his book, Vishwa and Joy, the co-author, is that the image, he says, basically the images of the Brahmin priests that the first Europeans encountered in their writings, and most of these people had never even been to India, right? So they were just making up as they were translating the Vedas and the Indian science. The image they constructed was essentially what Vishwa calls caricatures of rabbis drawn in brown chalk.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, we had Joydeep on. One of our first podcasts was with Joydeep, and we spent actually quite a bit of time with Vishwa and Joydeep when they were out in Los Angeles for an event. So we spent quite a lot talking about this stuff because it's a brilliant work. It's so meticulously researched and argued, and to be honest, like I couldn't find many other Indologists being able to contend with it outside of saying you're Hindutva, you're Hindutva, you're Hindu, and you're just like, this is how the level of discourse is. It's the same arguments that used to come in when Michael Witzel and Stephen Farmer used to fight with Vishal Agarwal and a few other people and just say you're just a rabid Hindu. Instead of dealing with arguments, their response is, it's basically, we'll cut you off by calling you a Hindu because obviously Hindus are terrible people and we're backward and we're tribal, as opposed to these enlightened Western thinkers who have been enlightened and moved beyond tribal nature. And this is a frustrating part.
Indeed, I think it's essentially, this is like the last frontier of racism, and Tulsi's run is bringing all these racists out of the woodwork, and it's becoming clear that they just hate anybody who's Hindu. And they're fanatical, and in any other context, their racism would have been called out.
And did you, by the way, Professor, I think you posted on your page when I think it was New York Times or Washington Post that did that article on Tulsi Gabbard's like religious background, and they're calling it like this cult and how they would approach it. And I don't think they would have ever done this to anybody else. Like even when Mitt Romney came up, people weren't writing these massive op-eds about like Mormonism and how like it is this kind of religion, whatever. But they write it about Tulsi's, like she was basically kind of the ISKCON lineage, right? She's basically like Hare Krishna, but they kind of found this particular guru and they kind of write this nonsense. And I'm just like, why does that matter what her guru was? She's not necessarily following that. She might be doing her own version of what, as Hindus, we can do whatever the hell we want, to be honest.
Right. Yeah, I think that was in the New York Magazine, and that was such a skillful piece of propaganda. I actually saw some of Tulsi's campaign people saying, "Oh, it wasn't banned," and I said, "No, please read my article because this is a very skilled propagandist at work over here, who again a white professor of creative writing, who is pretending to sort of separate Tulsi from Hinduism, and it was just so crafty. And in my piece in Medium, I unpacked it very, very carefully. But it's essentially, like you said, they wouldn't do this to the Congresswoman Omar. They wouldn't do it to Mitt Romney. They wouldn't do it to Obama being Kenyan. The right wing did it to Obama, right? Yeah. Calling him a Kenyan and a Muslim, right?
That's right.
But how come here? So you just rabid racism on the so-called left in America.
Yeah.
And it has one name, and that name is Hinduphobia.
Yeah, I agree. Racchit, yeah, I'm sure you have something because.
Professor, I'm very happy that you're calling it out for what it is. It is indeed Hinduphobia, and I think, and I'm very glad you brought up Vishwa and Joydeep's work because it has its roots in the 19th century. And it's essentially propagated up until now, where even Indians as ourselves, right, we view Brahmins as this priestly class, like the Catholic priests back in the day as they were envisioned, or the rabbis as they were envisioned by the Protestants, and how we've, kind of clamped down on people and their ability to express themselves freely. And it's very sad. And I noticed that the same kind of criticism isn't leveled at other people. And I'm not saying it should. I think it's wrong to level it at Hindus and anybody else, whether they're Muslims. But a similar argument could be made, and I'm just saying this to show how absurd it is, that, oh, you know what, let's single out the so-called Sayyids in the Muslim community, whether than India and elsewhere, because they claim descent from the Prophet, and thus they've dominated the rest of the community, and the rest of the community is essentially slaves to them. It's really, trying to pull that same argument, which would be ridiculous. But somehow, in the case of Hindus, it just gets a free pass. And as you rightly pointed out, it's really the left wing which is doing it more so than even the folks on the right. It's a really odd and weird situation. And I'm very happy that you, with your writings, especially on Medium, are actually shining a light on this.
And the funny thing, Professor, is like I think in our political spectrum in this country, we'd be considered liberal and or left leaning in terms of our policies and ideas of what we're like. I'm all for gay rights, transgender rights, all this stuff, right? But the moment we start talking about like Brahminism or Hinduism or whatever, we're automatically labeled like we're a fascist. And the crazy thing is, we're trying to be nuanced in our conversation, but because we don't blanketly see any sort of, because we don't say that's a hegemony in that situation, we're a fascist, we're nationalists, and the difficulty is, I think the problem across everywhere right now, globally, this is the inability for people to have conversations with each other without calling names and without kind of degrading each other's individuality into some sort of mass position, right? Like, I'm an individual. Talk to me as an individual, not like what you think a Hindu would be like. I think this is one of the big problems we have.
Yeah, and actually that allows me a convenient segue into my most recent publication, an ebook I wrote last year.
Okay.
Briefly earlier, and that is Writing Across a Cracked Word.
Yes, that's right. I have that on my Kindle. I have not got to it yet, though.
And again, it was basically, an attempt to overcome this polarization that you're talking about, because, it's like people are in different realities, there's a dominant paradigm which is very well ensconced in the media and in academia. And then we have all these citizen bloggers and, podcasters and writers who are trying to change it, but then, it's become so entrenched. So the book is Writing Across a Cracked World, Hindu Representation and the Logic of Narrative. And, the inspiration for that was a bit of spring cleaning I did last year, and I discovered I have a lot of books on writing.
Yeah.
And, and I just realized, we are paying a lot of attention to history, to philosophy, but we also need to understand that writing is a huge, huge investment, of time, skill, and talent. So Stephen King's book on writing, Ray Bradbury's Zen and the Art of Writing. So I wanted to write some kind of a writing for, essentially the Hindu citizenry, particularly those of a more progressive liberal bent, like most of us, to really express ourselves in a way that speaks the truth and also resists, the labeling, because the present labeling has not helped us. And one of the points I make in this book is about how a lot of Hindus, inadvertently call them, particularly in India, I don't think it's the case in the diaspora, they call themselves right wing.
Yeah.
There's nothing right wing about their positions except that they're just calling themselves that because they dislike the left. The left have the moral high ground when it's full of racists, like this Mother Jones person and others. You're not the left, you're not the progressives. Most I think average Hindus tend to be more liberal.
Yeah.
And so let's say it proud. We are Hindu and we are liberal, and now we are allowed.
Yeah. So it's funny that you say a part of the thing is we started Racchit and I started Meru Media because Racchit actually brought up this great idea. This was probably like a decade ago, about writing a book about what was it, Racchit? It was based on a book that you read.
Well, there were a couple of books we talked about, but I think one of them was 50 great books. I think, right? Hey, let's pick.
No, it's about the cultural terms.
Oh, yes. So it's not quite. So it's about cultural literacy. About how writing a book on creating a cultural literacy amongst Indians, whether in India and the diaspora, because they don't have it. Whenever we talk about these great philosophers or scientists from the past, it's a name that they've heard here and there. But, if there's any richly written piece, even like your writings, a lot of people today would actually have trouble understanding it, and they'll probably need some sort of dictionary and have to Google Kishkinda. Well, what is Kishkinda? Some of them wouldn't even know what Kishkinda refers to. So, really having a book that allows people from Indian origin or even foreign origin who are interested in Hindu culture to allow them to come up to speed and become culturally literate. And that's what we thought that, a book like this needs to be written.
So and that's where the origins of actually us doing the podcast came in. was the idea that we want to be able to bring people like you on and create an ecosystem, an ecospace in which where people become more literate and I mean, in this sense, more I guess auditory or visual too, with Indian Hindu thinkers, not only of the past but in this day and age, who are working on issues like you are, like Vishwa is, so that they're not just sitting back there in the spotlight. I mean, in the darkness, and for some academic to write about later, 50 years down the line. We should be promoting our own public intellectuals, like you might be your Sam Harris's and your Jordan Petersons and these kind of people that everyone knows about. We have just as amazing thinkers that need to be brought to the forefront and have a platform to talk and engage. And that's what we want to do, is kind of like, this is why we love having you on. We would love to have you back on again, maybe like with a couple other people. We could have like and I know something I was discussing with Nitin Sridhar is I would love to do what we used to do in our tradition, do the debates, to bring back like the Purva Paksha plus the your Siddhanta, and kind of talk with people and really discuss Indic ideas in unique ways. So
yeah, probably a debate between me and Kushal on left wing and right wing would be fun.
Yeah.
That would be. I think another enriching discussion would be to have you along with Vishwa or Joydeep, because talking about modern representation versus the 18th century and how they kind of relate to each other. Maybe you guys could do some collaborative work at some point.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to it because in decoding Hinduphobia, I think really what I want to show is the continuity in how present-day media discourses have not changed very much from the time that Vishwa and Joydeep have documented.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you're doing this, and I think this idea of a cultural literacy dictionary or a handbook or even a list on your website, I think this very, very helpful because again, it's all of this is about generational, intergenerational communication, and it's so fragile right now.
It
so
is.
Fragile.
And one thing that you brought up earlier that I wanted to pick up was I'm sure you grew up on like N.T. Ramarao as Krishna, Rama, like Ramanjaneyadam, Venkatesham Hatyam, all this stuff, right? Like I remember I grew up on that stuff. So it's so difficult for me to like I still think one of my favorite movies of all time is Ramanjaneyadam with N.T. Ramarao, and then there's also like in the Tamil cinema there'd be like Tiruvadiyadal, Thirumal Perumai, and Karnan, these great movies that talk about our traditions, our histories, our unique storytelling, right? And I feel like that's one of the things in this generation, the new generation, they don't have anymore, right? This is something that connected me to like my grandfather or my, like it was the traditional way where before TVs came, they probably heard this on radios or plays around their villages and stuff, and now we were talking the same language. But in this day and age, like I don't have kids, but like I wouldn't know if my kids would even at that point, or any other Hindu kids I see, would have any sense of what these stories are, or these like literary forms and even acting forms are. And I think that's something that's really missing in Bollywood, Hollywood, Collywood, whatever you want to call it. There's multiple different genres of films.
Yeah, I wanted to show you one thing. The book is right here. So this was actually my first novel.
Oh yeah, your first book. That's right.
Yeah, The Mythologist. And Penguin India published this, and so this was inspired by the kind of movies you mentioned.
Yeah.
And memories of Madras in the 1970s. The great studios of Kudambakam, and what you said is very true, because I think what's happened is, on the one hand, again, there's a media explosion now in India of superhero gods, like Chota Bheem and all these cartoons. Yeah. But what's happening is it's also getting diluted, because when you see gods more and more as merchandise and superheroes, and then you see academia saying all stories are the same, talk about interpretive fundamentalism there.
Right.
Eventually, what happens is, the kids don't know how to balance all these things, in their own minds. And eventually, they might just think, oh, your grandfather had a fundamentalist view of it, but these are all just stories. I mean, I was in a lit fest in Bangalore a few years ago where the moderator, who was not moderate at all, was trying to get people to say things like Rama and Krishna are just fictional characters.
Was this the one with
like,
you and Arvind Neelakantan? Was that the one where? Was this the interview or the panel with you were on stage with Arvind Neelakantan, right? The guy who wrote like I guess
Anand.
Anand, yeah, Anand Neelakantan.
That was in Jaipur Lit Fest with
Okay.
Anand. I thought that was okay. I mean, we had our own conversation. This was I think a year or two after that. This was in Bangalore Lit Fest, and I was on the panel. Kavita Kane, who's also who writes mythological fiction mainly about women, and this guy was kind of trying to push Kavita to say Rama and gods are fiction, and I almost felt like saying look, okay, Harry Potter may be fiction, but are there temples to Harry Potter?
Yeah.
So this is the kind of intellectual, again, coming back to the disconnect from the rest of India. But I think to conclude on a hopeful note, I think, what you said, our stories are the best thing we have for us. I mean, we've lost our forest, we've lost our mountains. Let's not lose our stories and our words, our language, our sensibility. And so whether it's writing or podcasting, I think the most important and urgent thing we need to do is, really restoring clarity in perception and in communication.
Absolutely. So, Professor Juluri, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to speak to us. Racchit, do you have anything else?
No, nothing. Prof. Juluri, thank you so much. I know we took up a little too much of your time, but I thought this was a wonderful conversation, and I hope to have many more conversations like this in the future.
Yeah, so if you're ever down in Los Angeles, let us know. We'll definitely meet up with you.
Thank you. I look forward to doing a live chat with you from LA next time.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Namaskaram.
Namaste.